Don't ask me why I
Well, hello everybody. So I'm getting over something, so pardon my voice. I'm not contagious and it's not COVID. I took several COVID tests. Ugh. But I want to say good evening and welcome to Roundabout Books. I'm Julie, the events manager. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and see us on this still kind of hot September day with all the smoke in the air. So we know sometimes it's more fun to stay at your house. If we need to turn the volume up at any time, let us know, but we're going to have Jane use the mic so that everyone can hear, and so it also can be picked up for our YouTube recording. So if you knew someone who couldn't be here tonight, they can still watch it online. But we want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that our bookstore resides on the ancestral unceded land of the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs, and in our immediate area are also the unceded lands of the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Tribes of Grand Ronde. We encourage everyone to learn more about the land you occupy and the story of its peoples. We have a lot of books about that topic in our local section, so if you have any questions after, please ask us. We'd be happy to look up a book for you. And then a quick reminder of some upcoming events. So this Thursday, local author Tom Wengler will discuss his new book, Backscatter, which is a psychological thriller set in Eastern Oregon in 1999, very Y2K, if we all remember that. I had just graduated high school, that was scary. Then on August 15th, local photographer David Youngwolf, who is actually in the crowd right now, and his co-author Kathy Hooker will present their pictorial essay collection, Navajo Mothers and Daughters Portraits of Beauty. Copies are up on our local shelf right now for purchase if you're interested. But be sure to visit roundaboutbookshop.com for more event information and subscribe to our newsletter if you aren't already. And as I mentioned, this event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of our events back to May 2020, a good side effect of the pandemic. We have these events in perpetuity. So as many of you noticed, we didn't have Jane's book out until today, and that is because it is the official launch day for Beneath the Bending Skies. So this is the first time you can actually purchase it. I don't know if anybody realized that Tuesday is always New Book Day. It's a thing. It has to do with shipping, so they make sure that the West Coast stores have it as on the same day as the East Coast stores. And then this is also Jane's 40th published book. So we're going to ask you, how did you do that? So if you weren't aware, Jane Kirkpatrick is the New York Times and CBA best-selling and award-winning author of such titles as The Healing of Natalie Curtis, Something Worth Doing, One More River to Cross, I'm not going to list them all, and A Sweetness to the Soul, which won the prestigious Wrangler Award from the Western Heritage Center. Her works have won the Willa Literary Award, the Carroll Award for Historical Fiction, and the 2016 Will Rogers Gold Medallion Award. She divides her time between Central Oregon and California. Please welcome Jane Kirkpatrick.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. It is a delight to be here, and my husband Jerry is feeling well enough, so he's there in the back. Some of you get my newsletter, and you probably know more about us than you care to know, but so often it includes what's happening with him. So I'm always happy when he can be a part of the group. So my job tonight is to tell you some stories, because that's what I do. But that's what you all do too, because stories are the most powerful way we have of organizing human experience. D.H. Lawrence said the stories tell us who we are and who we will become. And when William Faulkner accepted the Pulitzer Prize in 1954, he said the only stories with the writer's blood and sweat and tears were stories of the human heart in conflict with itself. I try, as I find these women and historical women that I find really interesting and want to learn more about and write about, that looking at the conflict of the human heart is really important for their journey. So this book is a little different for me. It's set in a landscape where I haven't spent a lot of time. It's mostly Montana, and San Juan Capistrano. So I kind of like that. I was happy with the mix of a northwestern frontier and in California, because that's become part of our journey back and forth the last 4 years and spending time in California. And I learned a lot of history about Montana that I didn't know, and was surprised at how worldwide their journey, the development of Montana really was, how it affected a whole lot of other states and territories at the time of their development. And then I discovered Mollie. Mollie Sheehan was her name, and I was intrigued by a memoir that she wrote, in part because she seemed like such an ordinary woman, and I loved that. I decided that I write about a lot of really quirky women, a few of them, like Carrie Strayhorn was kind of quirky from everything she didn't say, because I was intrigued by, she wrote this great memoir, but never said anything negative about her husband, even though he was like so bad. I mean, just so, like, why didn't she write it? Why didn't she talk about him in a way that was a little more reflective? And what I found I was really interested in Mollie is the kind of coming of age story that her journey tells us about being a young girl whose mother died when she was really young, and whose mother gave her a direction which might have been a purpose, but it also could have been a curse. And the direction was, be kind, which can be a really hard thing sometimes to do, and to look after your father, honor your father, and particularly in a religious sense, because she was a very devout Catholic. And so the struggle for her, as I read her memoir, to do right by what her mother wanted and to honor her father, and at the same time come to grips with what she wanted to do in her own life. So I hope that you will find it an interesting journey, and I discovered things about myself too. But I thought I would share with you a little bit of her story by looking through 4 lenses. And these lenses came to me when I was at a Women Writing the West conference in 2000 in Denver. And the organization had invited 4 women of color to present their paintings that they had done for Women of the West Museum, which is in Boulder. And now those paintings are in the Gene Autry Museum in Los Angeles, which is a phenomenal collection of art. If I used to kind of go, Gene Autry? Really? But yeah, really. He was a really fine collector of art. And so these 4 paintings, and they were, when I looked at them and I looked at their stories behind their paintings, I realized that these were the 4 threads that affect my own writing. This was why I wanted to, how I try to weave a story, is looking through those lenses or weaving up those threads. And I was so taken by this presentation that I asked for permission to get the slides and to use them in teaching writing classes and in talking about them in presentations, because they were such fascinating pieces. And I'll just give you sort of a gist of the 4 of them as I try to look at Mollie. And the first one is landscape. And the artist was Mary, anyway, it'll come back to me. But she's an Navajo woman, and she had painted a painting called Jackstraw. And when you first looked at it, it just looked like a bunch of weeds and little tiny insects on the weeds. But the longer you looked at it, the more you began to see things in that landscape. And her story about it was that jackstraw was a word that meant barren, useless. And yet, as you looked at it, and as she talked about her grandmother who would use the dyes from those insects to dye the threads for the rugs, or how they would use get the little tiny seeds from the plants and grind them and use them for flour. It was a story of the richness of what we often set aside and think and overlook. Her name is Mary Lou Whitehorse. Sorry, they did come to me. These are all. Anyway, I began to think more about landscapes and realized how every character that I write about is affected by the landscape that they are in. Either it's a conflict for them, or it's a struggle with them, or it's where they get some of their strength from. And I think for Mollie, it was a combination of those. She was a young child. Her father was a freighter, so he traveled between the mining towns and would bring supplies. And he often left her at the people that she described as not really knowing very well, and never knew if he was going to come back or not. And so she really became kind of an internal shy child, because she was often feeling uncomfortable. And then she found richness in particularly the mining towns, and the way the flowers bloomed in the spring, and how the snow would melt and provide pictures in her mind as they drifted away. Eventually her father marries, and she has a stepmother, and she has a half-sister, and later a half-brother. And these are people that impact her greatly, but the landscape was really what enriched her. And then when she had this sort of falling out with her father, but over a choice she made, and she ends up going with him in the family to San Juan Capistrano. Now here was another landscape, and she fell in love with the ocean, she fell in love with the sand, and she fell in love with the healing qualities of those things, because she was had been greatly affected by her father's forcing her to break off an engagement and to move with him, to honor him, and to look after him. Wilkie, who is an 18th century poet, said one time that I describe myself as a landscape studied at length and in detail, or like a word I'm beginning to understand. And to me, in some ways, that's exactly how Mary Lou's painting, where you sort of spend time with it, and then you begin to see deeper sides of it, and there's a richness there that maybe you think isn't there. I think people who sometimes come to Central Oregon, initially they're like, oh, sagebrush? Fortunately for them, there aren't very many snakes here, but when we went to our property that I called Rattlesnake and Rock Ranch a number of years ago, the first look at that was 12-foot tall sagebrush, and I knew there were rattlesnakes in there. The John Day River ran along it, which was great, but you could hardly see it if you were standing on the ground because of the height of the sagebrush. And yet out of that came a richness and a life that I did not imagine in the beginning. But the landscape itself became a place of great comfort for me. And I found my place to sit up on the side of a rocky ridge and be able to look across and find a quietness there that helped bring me nurture. And I would gather that even if you came to Central Oregon, maybe if your family was born here and you've never left, or if you came here to be closer to your grandchildren, which a lot of people do, or maybe you came here because of a job, but you're still here because there's something, the relationship that you have with the landscape of this place. The second thread was by an Asian artist, a Chinese artist, named Lu, L-I-U, I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly, but she had found some old photographs, and part of which her paintings were, I call them paintings, but I guess some of them were lithographs, but she found these old photographs, and one was of two sisters, and that's what she called the painting, the sisters, and one is carrying one on her back, and they're kind of leaning, one's leaning away from the one who's carrying her, they're laughing, and she covered this with lots of Chinese characters from children's books, school books, and she identified that as sort of a place where about the strength of relationships. And it's like, who do you lean on? Who can you count on? Who can't you count on? What are the tensions? And when I started to write, I will spend time identifying possible tensions, and most of them are in the relationships. So, there's tensions between the landscape as well, but the really the tensions that will create the kind of stressors that you want your readers to feel. Because I know you don't really want to have trouble in your life, but in your books, you do want trouble. Because you would not read a book that was just, everything was fine, everybody got along great, it was wonderful. You know, I remember somebody telling me that their life had been just wonderful, that their children grew up, they were a doctor and a lawyer, and they bought them this big house, and it was just such a wonderful life. And she said, you should write about my life. And I'm like, what would I say? So, and I always tell people when they say I should write the book, I always say, no, you should write that story. Because you're the keeper of that story. And I'm sure if they wrote it, they would discover the tensions that are also part of that journey. So for Mollie, the big tensions were between her and her father. And he was a very loving man. He was Irish, and he'd come from Ireland. He was a very generous man. He brought his brother and his brother's children from Ireland to Kentucky, and then eventually up into the Montana, the gold fields, and helped support them, helped give them a life. And when his brother died, he continued and looked after the children. They moved with them to Montana and to the Last Chance Gulch, which eventually became Helena, Montana. And so he was very generous, but he was very controlling of her. And she and her stepmother got along great, and as she aged, and they would try to find things to do during the cold months when people weren't mining, her stepmother started a boarding house. But when he found out about this, he was really distressed, and he stopped it, and he said no, he didn't want people oogling his daughter. And one of the things as she got older, she had this gorgeous, long, red, ginger hair that she could sit on. And he admired, when he would home, he would brush it, and they would have these conversations together. And he didn't like that she loved to, I call it declaiming. You know, she would speak Shakespeare's plays, or she memorized Chief Blackhawk's final speech when he went around the country, and she would do that for the after dinner crowd. And he didn't like when he saw how people looked at her. He didn't like that, so they closed that facility. And he had other sorts of, well, they would go, she and her stepmom would go out for dances because there was something to do. He'd be gone for a year at a time. He'd come home and find out they went up to the dances, and he'd strike that off. And so she took her time when she was close to 16 and had fallen in love with Peter Ronan, who had been her father's best friend. Peter was probably a few years younger than her father, but he was 10 years older than Mollie. And when Dad found out about this, he broke up the engagement and then moved them to Southern California, to San Juan Capistrano. So the relationships, the biggest one that she had to deal with throughout her life was trying to get some kind of satisfaction for her father, that she was a good child, she was a good person, she tried to do everything he wanted her to do, she taught school when she thought she was a terrible teacher, and I think she probably was, and so, but he wanted her to teach school because that could bring some money into the household, and I think he thought he could keep her at home for the rest of her life. So there were a number of other tensions in the story and the relationships, but hopefully as you read it, somebody emailed me yesterday and said, I'm on page 104, and he's just made her break up the engagement, and you're sending them all to California. Do I want to keep reading this book? And I said, hope springs eternal. The third thread that I spend time with is what I call work. And in all of the books, that's a huge part of what I have discovered about the depth of these people who came before us and their struggles, but how work either fed them, or how it was an obligation for them, or how it helped define them. And for Mollie, the early work she did was she eventually, when he drags them out of Helena, and they spend almost a year at the railroad in Utah, and then he allows them to set up a tent kitchen, and he wants Mollie to serve because they'll spend more money. So I mean, there's confusion about, doesn't want people to ogle over, look at her, but at the same time, it could be helpful for money. And the work for her was horrible. She didn't like having the railroad guys come in, and she was uncomfortable with that. Later, when he wants her to teach again, she's uncomfortable teaching. But she does agree, once they're in San Juan Capistrano, to go to the convent and to be trained there as a teacher, thinking, okay, maybe I just need better training. And find some gratification, mostly in the teaching of music. And that became a really important part of her life. And later on, work with, when she and Peter do get back together, that the work that she does with him is when he eventually becomes the Indian agent for the Flathead Reservation near Missouri. And she is the wife of the Indian agent. And they served there for 17 years and were, from all accounts, well regarded, that they were the kind of agents that you would want to have, working with the native people and the various tribes that were there. I sort of dressed up tonight because I thought Mollie would be, because she always tried to look her best. And the original working title for the book was Always an Open Door. And she became very accustomed to native people coming in, many dozens of people. Their dining room tables sat 18, and it was often full. It was like a small community there with physicians, staff, and agriculturists, and because it was run well, and native people had been farmers and ranchers there for years, and so lots of people from the various military installations and other government entities would come, and that they would sort of have this showcase, basically, of what could work if you had honest brokers involved in the process. And this became part of her life, was to provide hospitality and to be always available to people in their needs. And then the last thread that I spend time with is what I call, and I forgot to tell you, the work painting was from an African American woman, and it's the painting, when you look at it, it's a woman, a colonial woman, with the white hat on and the white apron and a blue dress, and she's done the work from behind, and she's a washerwoman, she's holding a tub. And I remember when I first saw it, I thought, oh, it's too bad we can't see her face. But in fact, if you look at the painting, you see her face in the reflection of the tub of water. And I often think about, for women particularly, that our work is, who we are is reflected in our work, in that everyday work that we do to take care of the people around us and to take care of children, and sometimes get caught in that sandwich generation between looking after our elders and taking care of our children and trying to have a relationship that's solid with our partners if we have them. And so her that particular painting, I think, was really a very powerful statement of how women are often overlooked in their work. And when I'm trying to do research about women, I often can find things about their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, and their sons, but often find very little about them. And partly because they're working, but also because they would, if they kept notes, it's often on an almanac, and it's just a one-liner, like today the chicken stopped laying eggs, or just small things about their day. And when they die, those are tossed. And whereas a lot of men are interviewed, there are newspaper articles about them, And in this particular story, she did her memoir, which was sustained and lived past her. She had a few other letters that were collected, but her husband had volumes of work because he had to write reports for the agency. And he was a really fine writer, and so I was able to hear things he had to write about, and he also wrote for campaigns, for political campaigns, even though he never ran, but he did help with political campaigns. So, and that artist's name is, Jerry, why didn't I look this up before we came? I remember the names. That artist's name is, okay, it'll come to me. Okay. And then the last artist was Maria Rodriguez. And her painting is the reflection that I call the fourth thread, and that is spirituality. People's journey to try to find meaning in their life, whether it's through religious practices or through other kinds of practices. But I think that's part of the journey we're all on, is to make sense of what we're doing here. And Maria was a plasterer. She, in New Mexico, when you build a house, the women do the plastering. The men create the frame, but the women do the plastering. They are actually the home makers. And her painting is actually of the, remember the young woman, the young Hispanic singer who was killed by a railroad fan, and if you know the name.
Selena.
Yes, and that is the name of the painting, so thank you so much. But it's a painting of her as a skeleton, and she's dancing, and the floor is undulating, in movement. She's in the arch of a house, she's in the doorway of a house, a plastered house, and it's really a celebration of the Day of the Dead. And for Maria Rodriguez, that was something that her family did. They celebrated the Day of the Dead, and talking about death and talking about what happened afterwards was part of a comfortable conversation that you have with your children and you have with your parents, unlike a lot of Westerners who don't find that to be easily talked about. And for Mollie, I think that was really an important part of her life, because she had broken up the engagement in part because the priest, who she felt really close to, had said, if you do this, if you follow your father's guidance, things will turn out. It will be all right. And it wasn't so much that things happen for a reason. I don't think she believed that, but that her faith was so deep and profound that she really felt like whatever was happening was bad. There must be some reason that some lesson she was supposed to learn, and that was part of the process of her journey. And she spent time with the sisters, exploring her faith, and actually at one point she finally tells her father that no matter when she finishes her schooling, she will not become a teacher, that she will, if nothing else, she'll go back to Helena and see if there's still some sort of a relationship with Peter. It's now 4 years later, and then fascinating things begin to happen. And I think of them as not necessarily coincidental, but things that are just, the priests from Helena and the sisters from Los Angeles somehow get together, and they are part of this journey that brings these two people back together. And for Mollie, I think that solidified her faith, and that yes, there'll be bad times, and they will be followed by different times. And yes, there will be death and loss, and there will be people to help support you in that journey. And yes, there will be struggles, and the landscape and music and movement of various kinds, and the relationship she developed on this reservation, particularly with the native people, will all be part of the swirl that is her life, and that is all of our lives when we spend time thinking about those relationships that matter to us. So I hope that I've woven those particular strands well. And Allison Sarr is the name of the African American. It's so bad. It's just so bad. I do take my Prevagen, but it doesn't seem to matter all the time. So, and so I hope that you will find yourself inside this story. The man who wrote Passages to India said, "Give me and a story, and you'll have a reader for life." And I hope that that's what I've been able to do over the last 40 books, is not necessarily tell the same story. Oh, I hope I haven't told the same story. But I do think that within each story, there is a facet. I certainly find out things about myself I otherwise never would have learned if I hadn't written that particular book. And I think that that's a major reason why when someone does say to me, "You should write about that," or whatever, that I can tell them that, you know, if that story calls my name, I know that I would learn something about myself, but I wouldn't learn what you would learn, because you're the keeper of that story. And delightfully, I've heard from people who've actually gone back and they have written their stories and found it was such a gratifying experience. Some of them have gotten them published, which is even a greater gratification for people. But even the ones who didn't really want to get it published, they just wanted to get it down and try to understand why it wouldn't let them go. Why wouldn't that story about their great-grandmother or their grandfather, why did it keep coming up? Why did they keep thinking about it? So there's a great book, and I'm sure they have it here, called Your Life is a Book, How to Craft and Publish Your Memoir. And it's by two authors, Peterson and something else, two women, and it's a fabulous book. And even if you never wrote the memoir or never tried to get it published, their approach is so fascinating and insightful and asks such great questions, and they have so many great examples of people that they have helped to nurture this journey, that it's just a great read. And I've taught a couple of memoir classes, and I always include that one. So I highly recommend that for wherever you are in your journey.
It's Brenda Peterson and Sarah Jane Fryman.
That's it.
We don't have it in stock, but we can order it because I ordered it after you suggested it last time.
Okay.
At a Sasquatch Books that's up in Washington, but it hasn't been published since 2014.
I know,
So
but
hopefully
it
they'll
doesn't matter. It's
update
just
it.
a great book. It is. And one of them also wrote a memoir, her memoir. I think it's the Peterson person, that's called I Want to Be Left Behind. And I love it. She's a marine biologist, and the other, the layman woman is an agent in the Seattle area. So, and I actually heard from them because apparently I've talked about that book enough that they said, "Hey, we're really excited that you talked about it." So people were buying it. So I am I'm happy to be here with you. I'm happy to tell you a couple of updates of things. One of which is that the Homestead book, our memoir, has, when we left the ranch, we sold it to some people who were just wonderful people who never lived there full time. Like I said, they had the resources. Mm-hmm. So they used it in the summer and they brought their kids there, and they let us go back. They let us, Jerry and we hunted there, we spent a couple nights up there, and so it was wonderful. Because we didn't have any of the expense, we just could go and enjoy it. It was so wonderful. And then they sold it to the state of Oregon. So it is now part of Cottonwood Canyon State Park. So you all own part of the homestead, and I'm just delighted for that. That all happened just right before the pandemic, right before COVID. So it's not actually open. I think they're maintaining it, and the long-term plan was to have the ranger have that as a house, and that would be connected. It's 11 miles downriver from the information center at Burris State Park History, where the Highway 206 crosses and goes up towards Condon. So the book A Light in the Wilderness, which is the story of Letitia Carson and her, and also the story of Nancy Reed, and also a Native woman, the Kalapuya woman, and Letitia was one of the first African American women to come across in the Oregon Trail. She traveled with her white common law husband. They had one child, and when they got to the area that's now Corvallis, that area, they developed a farm there, and they made cheese, and they sold it to people coming to the gold fields into California. And then her husband died. And when he died, Oregon was not very kind to people of color. And so she was a free black, and free blacks were, the law said they had to leave within 6 months or they would be lashed. And the lash law stayed on the books until 1922. And they took everything from her. The potatoes in the field, they sold the kids' clothes, everything. And she maintained her cool, and she decided to bring a lawsuit, not as a widow, because she had no function as a widow. She was not allowed to marry because of the races. But she sued the estate for as a worker, as a laborer, and said, I worked for him for 7 years. And she won, even though the law said that people of color could not testify against a white person, but it was an all-male white jury. And then the administrator of the estate had also, they took everything and they auctioned it off, and that's how we learned about her, because the records were of that court proceeding and the auction were available. And but he never sold the cows, and there were 29 cows. And so she determined that he probably kept them for himself. So again, she got a lawyer and she sued him to get the money for the cows. And there had been testimony from one of Davy, her husband's neighbors, who said Letitia owned the cows. She's the one who developed that herd. And she won again. And then she moved to the Roseburg area and became one of the first women of any color to prove up her homestead under the federal on Juneteenth, it turns out, of 1868. So what's really fascinating about that story is that there is an elementary school in Corvallis that used to be known as the Wilson Elementary School, which is now known as the Letitia Carson Elementary School. And they've changed the name, and there'll be a big dedication on October 20th. Isn't that cool? And Letitia had 2 children, Martha and James. And Martha married a Umatilla Indian, and they had children. And of that offspring, there are 2 children, Joey and James Lavador, who are very renowned artists. And they are kind of contemporary landscape artists. And they have created 2 beautiful paintings that will be hung in the school that has a new addition built. And all of that's going to happen. The dedication is on the 20th of October. And there is a group called Letitia's Legacy Program, which includes Oregon State University, because their homestead is on the original. Is actually near the beef farms of Oregon State, and they had beef cattle, and they are working with BLM, with some nonprofit groups, small black farmers, Oregon Black Pioneers, and they've formed a 503c organization, and they are reclaiming the prairie near their property near the Silk Creek Valley. And they hope to build a structure that would be replica. They are working on a curriculum for talking about small farmers during that time period, and not just the big rancher type people and other large farmers, but how subsistence farming went on. And they're doing an archaeological dig there. And I was approached a couple of weeks ago by a film agent who had read that book and was really excited about that book. This morning, she met with a film producer whose film Blue Miracle won the best inspirational film a couple of years ago about an orphanage in Cabo San Lucas. Anyway, they met and they are going to meet again next week. So we are hopeful that this could be something that could happen again. Another sort of a way of extending the stories and the power of these stories, which I think really encourage people, particularly Letitia's story, because she never became a victim. She found a way, and she lived well with her neighbors, which I like to say, and they took strength from her. It wasn't that everybody else was rescuing Letitia. Letitia's journey was so powerful that it gave courage to the people around her. So that's what's happening in my life right now, except for packing. Because the movers are coming the 26th of September. So I have to remember what month this is. It's just so. And I was telling some people that right now we're going to put almost everything into storage, and we'll go to California, and then our plan is to, in the spring when we come back, I have some events scheduled, but we're looking at maybe purchasing a duplex or a condo. So if you know anybody who has a duplex, let us know. They're ready to sell, we're ready to talk. So, but anyway, that's the journey. I hope that your stories are, I hope you pay attention to your stories. And I'll just close with this story of a writer named Jan Rhys, R-H-Y-S, and she was asked why she wrote. And she said, all of life is like a lake made up of many stories, fed by many streams. Some of the streams are long and mighty like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and some of the streams are small like me. The size of the stream doesn't matter. All that matters is the lake. Feed the lake. So I hope you will pay attention to your own stories and let them feed the lake that we all benefit from as storytellers that we are. So thank you all. Sure.
Yeah. So does anybody have questions? Because I can always bring the mic out to you if it makes it easier.
Yes,
yeah.
there is that. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Okay.
Can you tell about why you changed the name? You said it started with a different name, and how you came up with it.
So when I write and submit it to the publisher, I have to give them 10 possible titles. Yes. And Beneath the Bending Sky was one of them. But my working title was, Always an Open Door. And so then editorial and marketing and sales, they all get together. And then they send me an email and say, this is the one we like, and here's why. And you decide what your battle is. And I thought this was actually a pretty good title too. So there's that. And the other thing that happens is I get to tell them ideas about the cover, but and then they submit a cover to me, and then I sort of look at it. And the original of this cover, I didn't like at all. And it didn't have Montana-like mountains. I mean, I don't know where. Well, the publishers, my editor's in New York. The publisher is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They don't know what a mountain is. And so I asked them, and I said, think big sky country, think Mission Mountains, think meadows and streams, and think buffalo roaming, think that. And so then the cover that came was this woman with these mountains with a little buffalo around her. I was like, so I said, and they were, the designer was very gracious, and I said, just get rid of the buffalo. It's not bad. It's just a woman. Even though I actually don't like people on covers, I like photograph covers. I like landscape covers. But anyway, so that was one I was willing to die for. You gotta get rid of them. There's just these cute little, it wasn't Yellowstone bison with the fur sort of, hide.
Shaky.
So what was your other question?
My second question, you don't have to answer it, but you said you learned something about yourself with each book. Can you share what you learned with this book?
I actually, what I felt I learned from this was to let go of being as controlling as I am, and that things happen, and that I cannot prevent things from happening. All I can do is prepare myself, and I think that's, as a parent, with a couple of the books I read where parenting was really a critical thing, I remember sort of coming to that conclusion for parents that you can't protect people from your children, from things happening. You can't, unless you lock them up in a bubble, but you can prepare them, and that's, grandma and grandpa can help, and teachers can help, and neighbors can help. But I have always had a tendency, when I was the director of the mental health program, I really felt like if things went wrong, it was because I didn't do something. I didn't prepare well. I didn't figure it out. I didn't anticipate. And then I carried a lot of guilt around a lot. And as a step parent, carried a lot of that around. But I think this book, she tried to be controlling, and her father was definitely controlling. And I think it was after she spent the time in the convent and came to the conclusion that she was not going to do what he wanted her to do. She'd done everything, and it didn't seem to make any difference for his belief in her that she could survive and make her own decisions. And that being kind sometimes carries a weight with it, because sometimes you have to do things that might hurt another person, and that doesn't mean you're a bad person. And I think she had to come to grips with that. So, yeah. Yes.
Somehow I missed what the fourth lens was.
They are landscape, relationships, work, and spirituality. Yes.
The title beneath the bending skies. I think of Montana as open skies. So what does that mean, bending skies?
It is actually, she talked about the bending skies in a poem that she wrote to Peter. And to me, I love the way they arced the font, the title. But the skies are so big in Montana, and it's like you can almost see the curve of the earth. And so that was the image that I was hoping to correct or to display. Yeah, it's just so massive and such big country. So, yeah.
Is the poem that she wrote in the book?
Not the whole poem, but it was actually like 4 lines. One of the things her father made them do, they had bought this scrapbook together, and they were going to put things in it, the two of them, and she had to give the scrapbook back. And before she gave it back, she wrote this poem in pencil. And then she thought, well, but I told my father I would cut everything off, so that's really not cutting it off if I put a poem in there for him. So she erased it and gave it back. But so he gets it, and when they reconnect, he's been trying to figure out what that was all that time, because the pencil was very faint. And so at that point, I do include in the book where she tells him what it was she was trying to say. So, yeah. Yes.
Will you be having any events in Montana and San Juan?
I'm doing some Zoom things in Montana, but I'm not going there. So.
What about San Juan Capistrano?
Oh, not San Juan Capistrano either. So I don't think I'm still. My life is still very strange. you know, it's like one day at a time, in part because of Jerry's, you know, health and what he can handle. So now it's, the house is sold, getting it emptied, giving things away, lots of things away. And then we'll actually stay another month in October at an Airbnb here because he got a deer tag. So hoping he's filling up to doing that, so we'll go back up to not our old ranch, but a neighboring ranch from our old ranch, and then there's the dedication of Letitia's school.
Yeah.
So, and then after that, we'll drive to California. And then in November, we're gonna fly back because now there are these flights between Redmond and Palm Springs. $39. Well, you have to pay another $40 to carry anything on. You know, it starts to get but still, twice a week. So we will fly. It starts November 11th. But Jerry is going to get his high school diploma on November 10th. I know in my newsletter I said October 10th. That was a lie, a mistake. And so, but some people contacted me and said, like your sister said, oh, we'd like to drive over. And I'm like, okay, but it's November. But so we're going to fly back up and on Alaska, and then we can fly home using the new airline, and we'll have a puppy.
What kind?
Cavalier King Charles.
Oh,
Right next, like 5 miles from our house, is a it's not a kennel because all the dogs live in the house, but a breeder, and it's called Storytime Cavaliers. Just sort of meant.
Perfect.
And so she likes to have names that are characters in children's books. And there are 2 Blenheims, which are the orange and white, if you know the coloring, 2 males, and one of them she's going to keep to use as a breeding stock. But she loves both of them, so we haven't been allowed to fall in love with either one specifically yet. But we did get to name it. So at First Prayers a couple of Sundays ago, our pastor was telling a story about a guy he knew from Chicago whose name was Rupert. And he said, who has a Rupert in their life? And I leaned over to Jared and I said, that's a great name for a dog. Rupert. And so I Googled Rupert and children's characters, and up came a really popular British series for children called Rupert Bear. Isn't that great? So I texted Kim, the breeder, and I said, we like Rupert. And I gave her the link, and she goes, I like it. So one of those 2 dogs will be named Rupert, and then we'll get that dog. So on the 21st of this month. Yes.
How old were you when you wrote your first book?
The first book came out the day before I turned 45.
And has your writing evolved drastically since then, or?
I hope so. I mean, I hope I've learned something at each bend. I mean, I still take workshops. I still find things that are like, oh, I didn't realize that, or and I love to read, and I'm reading. When I get lost in a book, then I'll reread it because I'll try to figure out what did they do that captured me and kept me there without my trying to be analytical about it. So, yeah.
Maybe it was on Facebook or something, you alluded to last book and so forth. Is there anything you want to share about that? We would like to know.
So all of the books that I've written have been sold before I wrote them. I wrote a proposal, and I convinced somebody, this is a great story, and they paid me in advance, and then every time I have to say, I don't know if I can write this. It's like a major tension. And this last time in January, when we talked about some possible stories, and the publisher made an offer, and there was something in January that I just said, Jerry and I talked about it, and I said, I think maybe I need a rest. I think I need a break. And so I turned it down, and I have a story idea in my head and all of that, and I hope to put something together. But that happened in January. In February, Jerry fell, and that was first fall, and some of his systems stopped working. And then in March he got septic and was hospitalized in California, and then in April he had surgery, and then in May he had pneumonia back up here and was hospitalized. And so I'm just so grateful that last September 1st, which is when the book would have been due, I didn't have a book to write. I'm just so grateful. So the timing was. So I'm just going to try to go with the flow, be a little less controlled. I said, okay, I can't anticipate what's going to happen with this. Oh, and then the dog died. What else?
Yeah.
June, the dog died. It was just. Anyway. So I intend to write another book or more, but I'm not sure exactly when I'll get that put together. There's just other things.
Can you do it in reverse? Can you write the book on your own time and you're well enough knowing that
I think
somebody's
that's what I'll
going to
do. Yeah, I'll do that, and then I think that will reduce some of the pressure too. On the other hand, I admire greatly people who have written book after book and didn't have anyone waiting for it. That confidence to keep doing that. Because when I would get to the place where I go, oh, this is terrible, but why did I think I could write it? And I'm just like moaning and, I'm going to clean the grout and the tile or whatever. I don't, because I don't have time for that. Because people are counting on me. I have a deadline. I have people that if I mess that up, my agent will be upset. Because it is a tight business about when things can get published, when they come out, like just things like, Tuesday is new book day. Well, there's a reason behind all that, and it's tight, and people, there are a lot of people involved in the cogs of, publishing. So, I'm just stepping out for a little bit, and then I hope to come back and you'll be the first to know.
When you're ready.
Yes, yeah.
Will you be doing a memoir?
Oh, I did. No, that's Homestead.
Right, a sequel.
But since then,
A sequel?
aren't you tired of my life?
No.
It's the Story Sparks. That's my monthly memoir.
Right.
If you signed up for my newsletter, you'll know more about us than you probably want to.
And I'll Homestead, the movie is in progress?
It is in progress. Yep, I was texting with the screenwriter, but they have to raise the money, and it's, you have to find people who have money they don't know what to do with, because it's not a good investment. I mean, you don't get, nobody gets, very few people get rich, especially in sort of, marginal, streaming movies, and, there's an opportunity now more than ever with Netflix, and even Steven Spielberg, who had kind of poo-pooed the streaming services, has now signed a big contract with Netflix. So that might open some doors to little known stories that are out there. So, but I'm not hoping.
Well, maybe with the park opening up,
Well, they were excited that they'd be able to film there, because Oregon is a good film industry, and that's a public place. So,
Yeah.
But they better do it before they pave the Reptile Road, because they're talking about paving that crazy road. Who would do that? All right, well, you guys are great. I'm happy to sign the book.
So we're gonna have James over at the table with the cookies and tea, so if you didn't get any, please take some cookies with you. Oh yeah, we were telling people beforehand. Yeah, so those are from Blissful Spoon here in town, so they're both gluten-free and yummy. If you haven't had a chance to grab a copy, it's gonna be at the register, and Christine will be able to check you out. And then the last thing is, I just want to remind everyone that we're about to celebrate 6 years here at Roundabout, and if you have been here before, you know that we just recently expanded. We still have people on a regular basis around town say, I didn't know there was a bookstore even on the west side of town. So if you're so inclined, Google reviews are our best way of reminding people that we have been here for almost 6 years, and we are doing better than ever, but it's, the economy is scary sometimes. So we just keep reminding people that we're over here and that we have book clubs and events and a cafe and amazing authors stop by, and we still have people come in every day that say, I didn't even know you were here. So thank you for being here so much, everybody. Yeah, just grab a chair and then I'm going to start putting chairs away. But if anybody needs to check out, go right there. And if there's any other books you're looking for tonight, let us know. All right, I'm here.
Every 3 years.
So, yes, we tried to see it corrected. It had already been printed. So I'm just going to remind them that it's on YouTube.